In the last episode of my KTM 200 series, I unfortunately blew the bike up on my second ride since the rebuild. Multiple factors contributed to this failure, and hindsight is always 20/20. But we're going to waste no time getting this failure diagnosed and getting this bike back on dirt. We will talk about the failure and changes I'm going to implement moving forward once we've got it torn apart. Click that subscribe button to follow the series and other rad content. Relevant links are in the description, and let's dive into it. Well, the good news, top end looks great. The bad news, crank locked up. So let's get the motor out of this thing. Well, that was not ideal. Slipped when trying to remove the clutch hub nut and totally wrecked the inner hub. Not to worry, as Rocky Mountain ATVMC stocks just about every OEM and aftermarket part you could want for your bike, so I ordered a new OEM inner clutch hub and continued the teardown. Let's chat about what we got going on here, what failed, and possibilities of why. You can see here, the big end of the rod on the crank completely seized. This thing is frozen. You can see the crank looks like it got pretty hot here on the left side at one point in time. And you can see the left side crank seal did have a leak. If oil was getting out, that means air was getting in, ultimately resulting in an imbalance in the fuel to air ratio, not because of the carburetor, but because of a failing crank seal. Morgan at Highland Cycles was helpful in providing his insight and an explanation for this as well. He reached out and said, man, I've worked on a lot of two-strokes. I have never seen the big end of a rod seize as a result of the mixture I was running or the carb settings I was using. He's like, it had to be another factor. He asked about that crank seal and I said, you know what? It was actually leaking. There are, of course, some question marks. Remember, I did not rebuild the bottom end of this engine. I've never been inside the bottom end of this until now. I figured when I tore the bike apart, the motor was running strong. No need to tear into the bottom end if there aren't issues. Yet here we are. Who knows how many hours this bottom end actually had on it? Like I said, hindsight is 20/20. Could have rebuilt this whole motor from the get-go. Maybe I would have found that crank seal was leaking, or maybe on my first ride after the rebuild, the clutch slipping and that excess heat caused that crank seal to fail. Ultimately, I don't know exactly when or exactly why the failure happened, but it did. It's honestly great news that the carburation wasn't to blame. The guys at Smart Carb said, we've never seen this. We've tuned so many of these carbs for these 200s, never had any problems. So while it's not ideal, it's at least nice to be able to pinpoint the cause of failure and say, hey, maybe our carb settings actually were right. Now, the other interesting thing to note is it looks like this motor has been torn into before. At first, I was thinking that the big rod bearing blew up and caused some debris in there, but there's really no debris, although there is some signs of old wear and damage on the crankcase. And when I looked even closer, it appears it's covered in JB Weld or something like that. There is a tiny crack in the left side crankcase. It seems very surface level, but I'm going to go ahead and smooth that out with Pryme wheels and see what we find under that JB Weld mixture and if there's anything I need to be concerned about. So that's where we're at. Lots of work to do, lots of new parts ordered from Rocky Mountain, but hopefully we'll have this bike back up and running pretty soon here. Once again, constant learning experience. Can't be too mad.
So with all of this in mind, I got back to work. After removing seals, I gave the transmission bearings a feel, and honestly, they were not very smooth. I decided I would replace all of the bearings in the cases, so I removed final shifting components and put the case halves in the oven at 300 degrees to let those case halves expand and aid in bearing removal. The crankshaft is going out to Millennium Technologies to be rebuilt, and at this point we had the discussion of, should we replate the cylinder while we're here? There is a small amount of pitting in the cylinder. There's nothing that I'm overly concerned about, but I really don't want to end up in this situation again. So while those cases baked, I removed all of the power valve components, cleaned the cylinder up into a sink, and shipped the cylinder, head, and crank off to Millennium Technologies to be seen in a couple of weeks. The cases came out of the oven and nearly all of the bearings came out easily. The left side crank bearing was tricky because you can't hit it out and my slide hammer wasn't nearly large enough. It also didn't just fall out of the case after baking it. I had to get a little creative and carefully work it out with a punch at an angle. And finally, it is time to take a closer look at this crankcase damage and see what we're working with. I can't say I was expecting to be scrubbing a case half for my 200 in the sink. My optimism about the tiny crack quickly diminished as I ground down the JB Weld to reveal a 1/2 inch long crack that goes all the way through the crankcase. I realized I should probably look more closely at the right case half as well, which revealed a hairline crack in the case upon close inspection. I pondered how to proceed while jamming to one of the greatest Lil Dicky songs of all time.
And that's you, and that's true.
And while I would love to let you guys jam with me a little longer, I'd get a copyright strike and you'd probably unsubscribe. And here's another glimpse into how these days usually go. Monty got home with his date as I was half naked in the garage, sorting parts at 10:30 p.m. on a Thursday. I was already showered and ready to wind down for the night when of course something brought me back into the garage and I started organizing old 200 parts to help fund a new crankcase.
So that is where we're at. I've been reaching out to some machinists to see if they have the capability to reliably repair this crankcase. My other option is to get a brand new crankcase through Rocky Mountain for $650. Slightly less than ideal situation, and in either case, it's gonna be a couple weeks before I get this engine back together. So I wanted to make this video and provide an update so you guys weren't waiting 3 weeks to find out what happened to this poor 200. If you guys would like to, you can help fund this engine rebuild by getting yourself some merch on the website, which will also get you entered to win a KLX 143 pit bike. I am tearing into this motor later today. The original front number plate from this KTM 200 will get tossed in with the next Fender Boys merch order, so you get a little piece of memorabilia from this bike. You can also use the link in the description when making your purchases on Rocky Mountain, which earns me a commission at no additional cost to you. As always, I appreciate each and every one of your continued support on the channel. Leave me a like rating, leave a comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon with a very fresh KTM 200 engine.